As they wished, the UK left. Brexit, one of the biggest geopolitical risks to shake up the year, became a reality in June. For supporters, change has got to come as the Brits leave the EU and take control of their own borders and policies, from economic to social issues.
We will do what independent, sovereign countries do. We will decide for ourselves how we control immigration, and we will be free to pass our own laws.
Some did see Brexit as a harbinger of anti-globalization, the first wave of an insular tsunami that washes over the world, in particular developed economies. European countries such as France, Greece, and Spain see forces bent on dismantling the European Union gathering strength. The victory of Donald Trump in the US presidential election was another blow. The president-elect, famous for his averse tone against free trade pacts and migrants, vowed to pull the US out of a major trade deal, a priority in his first 100 days in office.
On trade, I am going to issue a notification of intent to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a potential disaster for our country.
Earlier, Trump called the World Trade Organization a disaster and said the US could leave the Geneva-based body. Last week, the WTO chief said there's no indication the US would move to leave, as Trump's trade policy is still unknown. Meanwhile, global trade is indeed not doing so well.
The outlook for trade is dismal. We have revised the forecast for 2016 from 2.8% to 1.7%, and if this does actually happen, it will be the slowest pace of trade growth since 2009.
The number of new trade deals is reportedly at its lowest in more than 2 decades. Concern is on the rise that a trade globalization trend, which started from the end of World War II, has been reversed. Or is it just a bump in the road for global free trade?
Great to have both of you. Zhang Jianping, the Director General with the Center for Regional Economic Cooperation, and Mr. Pascal Lamy, former Director of the WTO. Welcome to both of you. Mr. Lamy, if I remember right, earlier you were saying you love the Chinese phrase, whether the cat is black or white, as long as it catches the mouse, it's a good cat. So it seems that you love all kinds of trade mechanisms these days.
I do. I think opening trade is with removing obstacles to trade, and these are the mice, and whatever the color of the cat, WTO, bilateral, regional, unilateral, fine.
Is it because you have already left the WTO, therefore you say so?
No, I've always thought that these various ways of opening trade are not in contradiction with one another, they are in synergy.
But really, are there more obstacles to trade or fewer obstacles to trade? We see a lot of changes going on the political scene all over the world, Mr. Zhang.
Yes, especially today, if you look at the situation in global markets, both trade protectionism, both from developed economies as well as some of major developing economies such as Brazil, Argentina, India.
You see that also in the rhetorics of the campaign for President-elect Trump. You were saying, Mr. Lamy, right after the election, whether it wants to be a soft Trump or a hard Trump. What exactly do you mean when it comes to international trade?
Well, the reality is that we have a protectionist rhetoric discourse when it's about campaigning, but when you look at what happens concretely, you do not have that. So I do not agree with you that we are in a period where protectionism is on the rise. Protectionist discourse is on the rise. If I want to be elected, I will say I will slap tariffs on Chinese imports. But whether I will do that later, I don't think so.
Are you suggesting you don't think Mr. Trump going to do that? 45% tax, currency manipulator.
I think if you ask me whether I bet my shirt on hard Trump or soft Trump on trade, I will bet my shirt on soft Trump. I might not say the same thing about environment or about security, but on trade, I think US turning protectionist would be terribly damaging for everybody, including the US. And they will look at their own interests first if they are rational.
Would he be able to get across through his administration without really addressing the promises he made?
I personally believe that with a solid majority with the Republican Party in both the House and the Senate, it's going to be very difficult to go real protectionist.
Mr. Zhang,
Yeah.
Mr. Lamy is saying, take your time, take it easy, it's not going to be a problem.
Actually, from Chinese side, from all over the world, market is deeply worrying about, trade protectionism, operated by the new administration in the U.S. This is one thing. Second thing is that, in case that Trump to take some of, policies or countermeasures, I don't think, tariff, that would be the only one, tools. Because U.S. also is a member of WTO. The U.S. has to follow the rules and regulations in WTO. But you know that Trump maybe they will fight with China, with other developing economies.
Many would ask that question. I understand you were saying earlier, Mr. Lamy, it's up to interpretation to member states of the WTO what exactly protectionism means. Is it really that fluid? If it is that fluid, what does that mean to the fairness of WTO and also trade mechanism as a whole?
Protectionism is restricting trade in contradiction with trade regulations. That's what protectionism is about. If you ask me whether anti-dumping duties, when there is dumping, is protectionism, my answer is no. This is not protectionism. This is allowed, organized, regulated by WTO rules. And I disagree with these numbers, which I see in many excellent places, that count an anti-dumping inquiry or an anti-dumping measure as protectionist. If I do anti-dumping in a way that is not WTO compliant, this is protectionism. If I use science and precaution instead of protecting the producer to protect the consumer, this is not protectionism. If I apply a pesticide residue standard at my border, this is not protectionism.
Well, if that is the case, then we would seldom see protectionism around the world. We could always not believe the rhetoric of the politician. We're always going to see a beautiful world, whether it is pro-trade or against trade. In your eyes, is always good.
I'm not saying there is no risk. I mean, this protectionist discourse might be a danger. It might be a danger. So this has to be carefully watched, but I don't think it's good to cry wolf when the wolf is not next door.
The wolf is probably next door already. Look at many of the presidential elections inside Europe right now.
But this is where
the referendum, the Brexit, for example, and the one that is coming up in Italy, and also the German election, the French election. Look at what they are promising right now.
Don't you put that on the back of trade. The Brexit is not anti-trade. On the contrary, the British believe they will do better alone in the big sea of globalization.
Well, that's what the British believe, but not the rest of the world.
No. I mean, you're mentioning Brexit. The Brexit was much more about immigration than trade. As, by the way, the election of Trump, in reality, was much more about immigration than trade. And you should not confuse trade opening and immigration. These are two different things.
For Brexit, I think there is a very critical point. That is from the UK side. They hope that no, we don't want to have so a lot of immigrants. But meanwhile, we hope to negotiate bilateral free trade agreement with EU members. But the EU side says that no, you cannot just share our results, but you will not have some of burden such as immigrants. So that will depend on negotiation between two sides. But I like to mention one point, that is today why so a lot of developed economies in Chinese eyes it becomes, protectionism. So a lot of, manufacturing sectors actually already moving out of, both EU and the United States and concentrated in China, in other developing economies. And then China produces so a lot of goods because in EU they need to consume. So actually this is an international labor division process. And in that process, from EU side, maybe they will compare, the price from different economies,
right,
and they can have their voices.
Mr. Zhang, it seems that you're suggesting, well, Mr. Lamy is coming from those developed economies, and now he's not the Director General of the WTO anymore. He doesn't have to talk about free trade all the time, and therefore he's becoming a little bit more protectionist than he used to be. Mr. Lamy, respond.
No, I've always said, including when I was DG of WTO, that trade opening works because it is painful, and it is painful because it works. So why does trade opening foster growth? Because it increases productivity. And the reason why it increases productivity is because it increases competition. Now, increasing competition is a painful process for the weakest in the system. There are lots of winners.
Who are the weakers?
There are lots of winners, there are lots of losers, and depending on the capacity of countries to address properly this winner-loser equation, you may have very different results. Now, the real protection for workers is not protectionism. It's social security. It's reducing social insecurity. And this is where the US is much weaker than Europe. US spends 35% of what it produces in redistribution. EU spends 55% of what it produces. This 20% difference, and I'm not saying it's all absolutely well used, but this 20% difference is a caution for the ones that are the victims of economical change, which is fostered by international trade.
A protection of workers, if that is being used as an excuse for not doing further trade or free trade, that will become protectionism, of course.
I totally agree with you.
Okay.
This is why I've always said, and that's why I called it the Geneva Consensus, not the Washington Consensus.
Two questions, very briefly, from you. Direct answer, please, Mr. Lamy. One is, what's going to happen with those elections going on inside the European capitals? Free trade, is this still going to be a big topic? How likely is it going to be portrayed this time? Secondly, what do you think about the role of the WTO and the fate of the WTO? Of course, you are now will be free to talk about it.
On the first question, I think the EU trade policy will remain open. It's an oil tanker. It doesn't change course easily. There are many reasons why EU needs open trade, not least because growth in the European Union is lower than in the rest of the world, so they need to access growth elsewhere. On WTO, I'm not of the view that WTO has serious problems. It's the only serious multilateral trade organization. It is where trade disputes are properly, legally, fairly adjudicated. And it is their agreements like the trade facilitation agreement happened 3 years ago, which is a big step forward in reducing cost to trade.
China, of course, talking about OBOR, Belt and Road Initiatives. It is not just about trade, it's about many other things at the same time. How much future do you think that would have? How much is that going to be the good cat, as Mr. Lamy earlier mentioned? That's likely to catch the mouse.
Especially for trade, you can find that this year and last year, China's totally international trade volume actually negative growth. But if you look at China's trade with those countries along the routes, to double-digit growth rate. So that means that we are exploring the market potential over there. Also, I think that EU countries can benefit from that huge market.
Of course, some of the European capitals already included in the Belt and Road Initiative along it.
No, I think it's a bit like what China did when it joined WTO. China is subscribing an insurance policy against trade restrictions. So, insurance policy against trade restrictions in WTO, insurance policy against trade restrictions in easing the flows of trade either through the sea with ports and harbors, or through the land with rail, with better infrastructure. I think it's the same concept. It's facilitating trade, reducing obstacle to trade. Among the obstacle to trade, you have regulations. That's for WTO. You have infrastructures. That's for One Belt, One Road.
Do you think that can be an interesting alternative when the US capital is struggling to find its newest version of free trade mechanism?
I mean, I think the One Belt, One Road is something which is very much between China and Europe, and to some extent the Middle East, and maybe a bit Africa. It's just that you have the Pacific Ocean that separates you from the US, and that's a much larger distance. And history has shown that this Silk Road, which is now One Belt, One Road, is something that works. It's relevant. It did work in the past, so it can work in the future.
Mr. Zhang?
Yeah. More importantly, actually now China's outward investment is going to those economies. Also, we can produce those products. Also, some of products can re-export to Chinese market, because in the future, Chinese market will become the biggest one in the world, especially between China and the EU. I hope that on this platform, we can promote our bilateral free trade agreement in the future.
TPP was regarded as an alternative, at least according to Washington, to WTO. But of course, it seems now it is already dead in its cradle with the new president-elect. So what's going to be next? Is it WTO still going to be the platform for everyone and the platform for the future so far? Or is there likely more alternatives coming up for the future?
I think it's not a question of either or. It's and. It's and.
I agree.
WTO is one place, and it's the best one because everybody is around the table. So it's the best way of leveling the playing field. But if this is not available, or if countries want to go further, they just go bilateral. And this is what happened for a long time, and this is what will be happening. And the fate of TPP is just a confirmation that there's not the easy road, which is bilateral, and the tough road, which is multilateral. It's a confirmation, and those of us who needed this confirmation have it, with US stepping out of the signature of TPP. Let's remind, TPP was not in force, and was not enforced, and is not enforced. That's a reality which we've known for some time.
Pascal Lamy, Zhang Jianping, what a pleasure to have both of you on my program. Thank you so much for being with us.